CJRed presents Accidental Proposal by CJRed. Chapter 7. Watch Your Mouth. The next day, when she went down to breakfast, 3 students, all from Gryffindor, called her names as they rushed by. Hermione simply decided to ignore them, but when she sat down at the Slytherin table next to Theo, and some Ravenclaw called her a Death Eater's whore, she knew that ignoring that was not an option. Before Theo could say anything, she stood up and said very coldly, "Would you care to repeat that?" The boy went a little pink and said loudly, "You're a Death Eater's whore." Gasps sounded throughout the great hall, and she saw Ginny stand up, so she held up her hand. "I can't curse you. However, I can make you understand that language like that is not acceptable." She waved her wand, and the boy's mouth filled with soap bubbles. His friend looked at her angrily. "You said you couldn't curse us!" Hermione sat down, looking bored. "It's a charm, not a curse." Theo chortled a laugh, and Hermione turned to smile at him. He winked at her and poured her a goblet of pumpkin juice. "Well done, sis." Hermione snorted and drank her juice, watching as the boy rushed over to the Ravenclaw tower so that his housemates could undo the charm. She looked up to see that McGonagall was looking furious, but not at Hermione. She was glaring at the 2 Ravenclaws. When she finally looked at Hermione, she nodded once, letting Hermione know that she had approved. Hermione gave a half smile and turned back to listen to Theo complain about his schedule. Draco showed up and sank down next to her. She grinned at him a bit bleary-eyed and poured him a cup of tea. "Sugar? Cream?" Draco shook his head and took his tea, groaning as sunlight from the windows at the table. "It's too fucking early." Hermione giggled and poured her own tea. "Not a morning person?" Draco grunted and then looked up, scanning the room before he said, "Why is Ravenclaw glaring at us today?" Theo snorted. "Hermione charmed one of their mouths to be washed out with soap." Draco's eyes widened as he looked at her. "Why?" Hermione sighed, glaring at Theo. "His mouth was dirty." Theo grunted but looked away, and Draco sat up suddenly, very much awake. "Hermione, how was his mouth dirty?" Hermione smiled at him and said, "Toast?" Just then, a 6th year outed her. "That boy with the blonde hair in the middle of the Ravenclaw table called her a Death Eater's whore." Draco stood up and bellowed, "What?" Hermione grabbed his robes, trying to pull him down. "Malfoy, damn it, Draco, sit down!" He plopped down into a seat, but was breathing hard. He had spilled his tea, too. Hermione cleared away the mess and poured him another cup. "I handled it. Can we drop it now?" Draco was growling, so she turned to Theo beseechingly. Theo sighed and shook his head. "It's an honor thing, Hermione." She continued to glare at him. "Theo, that honor nonsense is why I was sent to live with Muggles in the first place." Theo blanched, but then said, "Not the same, Hermione." Draco was glaring at the Ravenclaw table for the rest of breakfast. Ginny rushed over, her face flushed. "I was going to deduct points and hex them, but I think your way worked better," she said in a fierce whisper. Hermione nodded and then sighed. "We can't hex them, but we're allowed to use charms, so I figured a good Scourgify would do the trick." Neville walked up, his face angry and his arm around Luna. "That's not okay, Hermione." Hermione shrugged. "It's going to happen. Just keep your cool and try to ignore them, Neville." Luna said dreamily, "I think Hermione is right. We should just ignore them. It's what I do." Hermione smiled at Luna, and then gave Ginny and Neville a stern look. "I can handle a few taunts, guys." Ginny's face was still fierce, but she said, "How are the snakes treating you?" Hermione shrugged. "Fine, but I'm not a mudblood anymore, am I?" Ginny cringed. "Don't say that word, Hermione." Hermione sighed. "Sorry." Ginny sighed and tugged her towards the hallway, where they would be taking Transfiguration. The first few weeks of the term passed quickly. Hermione was overwhelmed by the workload, and had left to deal with her new brother who demanded rather a lot of attention. As neither of them had family anymore, she assumed he was as lonely as she was, and she didn't kick him out when he showed up in her common room, or shadowed her in the library, and she ate every meal with him. The taunts continued, although they were much milder than the whore one the Ravenclaw boy had used. Hermione ignored them all, and even found a few humorous. Overall, the perpetrators usually didn't say anything to her face. They wouldn't survive a battle of wits against Hermione. She was in the library when a Hufflepuff made a rude comment about her father. Hermione had asked sweetly which father the girl was referring to, the one who had abandoned her and she had never met, or the one she had been forced to obliviate his memory to save. The Hufflepuff girl blanched and looked a bit sick as she rushed off. Theo snorted. He pretty much let her handle these types of things now. After all, she did so with such style. "She's going to be crying into her pillow tonight," he said, looking up from his potions essay. Hermione grunted and shrugged. "If you're trying to make me feel guilty, you are wasting your time and mine." Theo grunted back at her and pushed aside his essay. "Yes, I know. Very Slytherin of you, by the way, sis. The lack of guilt." Hermione shrugged. "I stopped feeling guilty once they called me a whore. If they want to play this game with me, they better be prepared for the consequences." She waved a hand at him, dismissing the topic. "So how goes Quidditch practice?" Theo smirked. "Good. We have a great team this year. You're going to be supporting us against Hufflepuff, aren't you?" Hermione sighed, resigned to her fate. "Yes, dear brother, I will be. But you are on your own against Gryffindor." Theo snorted at that and rolled up his essay. "I'm off to bed. Can I walk you to your tower?" Hermione looked down at her book and groaned. "No, I will be at least another hour or two." Theo shook his head and said, "Right, someone will be back for you by midnight." Hermione didn't argue the point. Theo had decided that it wasn't safe for her to wander around the castle at night on her own, since she had been almost jinxed the first week by a fellow student. Hermione didn't have the energy to fight with him over it, so she had just agreed, and since then, one of the 3 Slytherin 8th-year boys had taken over walking her back from the library at night. Usually it was Theo, but sometimes it was Zabini, and a few times it had been Draco. She didn't think it was necessary, and usually grumbled about it, but lately she had been hoping Draco would show up. She was rather surprised to find that she found him fascinating. He had impeccable manners, was witty, and always made her laugh no matter how tired or stressed she was. Last night he had escorted her back, and she had been left a little breathless when he'd put his hand on her lower back as they moved around Peeves's latest trap in the corridor. Every day she had her meal sitting next to him, and she was starting to think he had put a spell on her. Whatever side he sat on tingled and burned, and she found herself anxious if he was late. He was very careful around her in public, however. He never touched her, singled her out, or even spoke to her really unless it was with a group. It bothered her, and she wasn't sure why. At precisely midnight, she turned to see Draco walking into the library, with his face set in his careful, impassive mask. She gave him a small smile as she finished packing up. "You don't have to do this, you know." He shrugged and took her bag out of her hands, gesturing for her to walk ahead of him. "Keep your wand out. I just ran into some 7th years." Hermione frowned, but did as he suggested, noticing that he had his wand out too, held loosely in his left hand. He kept close to her as they maneuvered the corridors up to the Gryffindor common room portrait. They didn't run into anyone, and she sighed in relief as she took her bag and smiled at him. He was watching her closely. Suddenly, he ran a finger lightly under her eyes. "You are not getting enough sleep, Granger," he said softly. She sighed. It was amusing to her that he very rarely called her by her first name, but when he did, the tingles were amazing. Not that she didn't sigh when he simply called her Granger in his sexy, silken voice. However, he was still staring at her dark circles, and she gave him a small shrug and said then, "Nightmares." Draco looked at her, his eyes going wide, and then he nodded, his tone soft. "I have them too. Always the same." Hermione shivered. Mine differ, but the terror is the same. What are yours about?" He looked at her and flushed a bit before he took a step back and said, "You, being tortured in my house, and I can't stop it." Hermione's mouth fell open, but before she could say anything, he turned and walked swiftly down the hall. She turned and found the fat lady giving her a long look. Finally, the old woman said, "That young man fancies you, Miss Granger." Hermione gawked at her, and then said the password and rushed through and off to her room.